How exhausting this all is. It feels like nothing around me makes sense anymore. When will this finally end? The words came out heavy, barely more than a whisper, as I stared at the gray carpet in the corner of his office. The small patterns in the fabric blurred as I blinked, trying to keep my emotions under control. My fingers twisted the edge of my sweater, a nervous habit that had become second nature over the past few months. Across from me, Dr. Morgan sat quietly, his pen resting lightly in his hand. He always did this, waited, gave me the space to fill the silence. His steady, calm demeanor was supposed to be comforting, I knew, but it only made the weight in my chest feel heavier, like he was waiting for me to unravel everything I'd been trying to keep inside. "I'm just tired," I finally said, my voice cracking slightly. "Tired of feeling like this. Tired of waking up every day wondering if it's worth it. I don't know how much more I can take." Dr. Morgan's expression didn't change, though I noticed the slightest softening around his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You've been carrying this for a long time," he said, his voice low and even. "It's no wonder you're exhausted. But the fact that you're here, talking to me, means you haven't given up. That counts for something." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "It doesn't feel like it. Being here doesn't change anything. I'm still stuck in this loop. I wake up, I go through the motions, and then I go to bed just to do it all over again. It's pointless." He didn't respond right away, which irritated me more than it should have. I looked up, meeting his steady gaze. He wasn't judging me, he never did. But sometimes I wished he would. Maybe then I'd feel something other than this suffocating numbness. "I can't stop thinking about him," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I keep replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what I did wrong. One minute, he was telling me he loved me, that I was his everything. And then, nothing. He just left, like I didn't matter at all." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I bit my lip, refusing to let them fall. I hated crying in front of him. It made me feel exposed, vulnerable in a way I wasn't ready to accept. "What do you tell yourself about that?" Dr. Morgan asked, his tone careful but probing. "When you think about why he left?" I shrugged, my hands clenching into fists in my lap. "I don't know. That I wasn't good enough? That I was too much, or maybe not enough? He never really said why, just that he thought it was for the best." My voice broke on the last word, and I hated myself for it. I looked away, unable to meet Dr. Morgan's eyes. "He said I deserved better," I continued, my tone laced with bitterness. "That it wasn't about me, it was about him. But if he really thought I deserved better, why didn't he try harder? Why didn't he stay?" The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Dr. Morgan didn't rush to fill the void, and for once, I was grateful. It gave me a moment to gather myself, to push the storm of emotions back into the box where they belonged. "When someone leaves like that," he finally said, his voice steady, "it says more about them than it does about you. But I understand why it feels personal. It's hard not to internalize something like that, especially when you cared as deeply as you did." "Cared?" I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head. "I still care. That's the problem. I can't stop caring, no matter how much I want to." I could feel Dr. Morgan's eyes on me, measuring my words, my tone, the way my hands shook slightly as I spoke. "Have you thought about what caring for him has cost you?" he asked gently. His question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but found that I couldn't. Because the truth was, I hadn't thought about it. Not really. All I could focus on was how much I missed him, how much I wanted him back, even though I knew deep down that he had hurt me in ways I couldn't yet put into words. Dr. Morgan leaned back in his chair, giving me space to process. "Grief is complicated," he said after a moment. "And losing someone you love, even if they're still alive, is a form of grief. It doesn't follow a straight path. Some days will feel unbearable, like you're drowning. But other days, you'll find moments of peace. And those moments will get longer, even if it doesn't feel that way now." I wanted to believe him, but the idea of peace felt impossible, like some distant, unreachable dream. "What if it doesn't?" I whispered. "What if I never get better? What if this is all there is?" Dr. Morgan's gaze softened. Then we'll keep working on it. Together. As long as it takes. His words should have comforted me, but they didn't. They just made me feel tired. Tired of the work. Tired of the hope I couldn't bring myself to feel. I nodded anyway, knowing it was what he wanted to hear. The session ended shortly after, and as I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I felt more adrift than ever. The streets were alive with the hum of the city, couples holding hands, friends laughing, cars honking in the distance. But I didn't belong in that world anymore. I was a ghost, invisible, untouchable. As I made my way home, I thought about the girl I used to be before all of this. The girl who believed in love, who thought the world was full of endless possibilities. That girl felt like a stranger now, a distant memory that didn't fit the person I had become. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small ember of hope still flickered, faint but stubborn. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better, but not tonight. Tonight, all I wanted was to disappear into the darkness and forget. I can still remember how it started, even though those memories feel more like a dream now, beautiful but distant, like something I watched unfold from far away. We were so young, caught in that heady mix of innocence and reckless passion that only comes with first love. Back then, everything felt pure, untouched by the complications of the world. We met at a summer festival in the park. The air was warm, thick with the scent of popcorn and flowers. I was there with some classmates, half-heartedly pretending to enjoy myself when I saw him for the first time. He was standing near the carousel, laughing with a group of friends, and something about him caught my attention instantly. It wasn't just that he was good-looking, though he was, with messy hair that caught the sunlight and a smile that seemed to light up the whole park. It was the way he carried himself, so effortlessly confident, as if the world bent slightly to his will. He noticed me watching, and to my shock, he walked right over, as if we'd known each other forever. "Hi," he said, that smile never wavering. "You look like you're trying to disappear into the crowd. Need rescuing?" I laughed nervously, caught off guard by his directness. "I'm fine," I managed, though my cheeks burned. "Well, in case you change your mind," he said, slipping a folded napkin into my hand. I opened it to find a scrawled phone number and his name, Ethan. From that moment, everything changed. He called me that very evening, and our conversation lasted for hours. We talked about everything, our favorite songs, the places we wanted to visit, the ridiculous things that made us laugh. There was an ease between us, as if we'd been waiting our whole lives to meet. Our first date wasn't extravagant, just coffee at a quiet cafe on the corner of a cobblestone street, but it felt magical. He teased me for ordering the smallest drink on the menu, and I teased him back for adding too much sugar to his. By the end of the afternoon, I couldn't stop smiling. "You're different," he said as we walked toward the bus stop. "Different how?" He shrugged, looking at me with that same disarming smile. "Like you see the world differently, in a good way." From that day on, we were inseparable. I'd wake up to his good morning texts and fall asleep to the sound of his voice over the phone. He became my world, the axis around which everything else revolved. I gave him all of me, every thought, every dream, every fragile piece of my heart. I wanted to be perfect for him, to make him as happy as he made me. I memorized the things he loved, his favorite meals, the books he always said he'd finish but never did, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams. I wanted to be everything he needed, and for a while, I thought I was. Our days were filled with quiet, tender moments that felt like they were ripped from a love story. Long walks in the park where he'd pick flowers and tuck them behind my ear. Spontaneous road trips to nowhere with the windows down and our favorite songs blasting. Even the smallest gestures, a handwritten note slipped into my bag, a cup of tea waiting for me when I was tired, made me feel like the luckiest person in the world. But what I loved most were the nights. We'd lie under the stars, talking about the future as if it were something we could shape with our hands. He'd tell me about the house he wanted to build someday, how it would have big windows and a garden where we could grow flowers. "Do you think we'll still be like this?" I asked once, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. Yeah, he said finally. We will, because nothing else makes sense. I believed him. I believed in us. But looking back now, I can see how much of myself I lost in trying to keep that dream alive. I spent so much time trying to be perfect for him that I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I ignored the little cracks that started forming, the times he seemed distant, the moments when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. At the time, I thought they were just bumps in the road, small obstacles we'd overcome together. Love, I told myself, wasn't supposed to be easy. But now, those memories feel bittersweet. The late-night drives, the inside jokes, the way he used to kiss my forehead like I was the most precious thing in the world, they've all become fragments of a story that no longer belongs to me. There are days when I still catch myself replaying those moments in my head, as if I can rewrite the ending by sheer force of will. But they're just memories now, faded and fragile. I can't help but wonder, if I could go back, knowing how it would all turn out, would I do anything differently? Would I hold back, guard my heart more carefully? Or would I give it all away again, knowing it would eventually shatter? Maybe I'll never know. What I do know is that he took a part of me with him when he left. And no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get it back. For better or worse, he's still in every corner of my mind, a shadow I can't escape. And even now, after everything, I'm not sure I want to. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, maybe I would have seen it coming. Maybe I could have prepared myself. But that's not how it works, is it? The little cracks in our relationship appeared so gradually that I almost didn't notice them. Almost. At first, it was small things I could excuse. He stopped texting me good morning every day. He canceled a date here and there. Work's just been crazy, he'd say, with an apologetic smile that somehow made me feel guilty for even questioning him. And I believed him. Of course, I did. But the cracks kept growing. Our conversations, once endless and full of laughter, began to feel forced. I'd tell him about my day, only to be met with a distracted as he scrolled through his phone. When I asked him what was wrong, he'd shrug and say, "Nothing, you're overthinking." Maybe I was. I mean, I'd always been the one who cared too much, who read too deeply into every little thing. So I started convincing myself that it was all in my head, that the warmth in his eyes hadn't dimmed, that his touch hadn't grown colder. But deep down, I knew. The person I had fallen in love with, the one who used to surprise me with flowers just because, who held my hand like he was afraid to let go, was slipping away. And no matter how tightly I clung to him, I couldn't seem to stop it. One night, I asked him directly, "Are we okay?" He looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed like I'd interrupted something important. "What do you mean?" "You just seem different lately," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Distant." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing's changed." But everything had changed. The excuses became more frequent. "I'm tired. I've got too much on my plate right now." "Can we talk about this later?" Later never came, and yet he didn't let me go. He held on, just enough to keep me tethered. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when he'd remind me of the person he used to be. He'd kiss me on the forehead and say, "You know I love you, right?" Or he'd hold me in his arms after a fight and whisper, "I don't want to lose you." Those moments were like breadcrumbs, leading me back to him every time I started to wonder if I should leave. But they weren't enough. He started using my love against me in ways that were so subtle, I didn't realize it at first. When I tried to talk to him about my feelings, he'd make me feel like I was the problem. "You're too sensitive," he'd say, shaking his head. "Why do you always make everything so dramatic?" I'd bite my tongue, swallowing the words I wanted to say. Because maybe he was right. Maybe I was being too sensitive. I stopped voicing my needs. I stopped asking for the little things that used to make me happy. The good morning texts, the random hugs, the way he used to listen so intently when I spoke. I told myself it was better this way, that if I asked for less, I'd be disappointed less. But the truth was, I was already disappointed. I hated how small I felt around him, how insignificant. It was like I had been reduced to a shadow of myself, existing only in the spaces he allowed me to occupy. And yet, I stayed. Because despite everything, I still loved him. I loved the way he used to make me feel, the way he'd once looked at me like I was his whole world. I held on to the hope that he could be that person again, that we could find our way back to what we once were. But hope is a dangerous thing. I remember one night in particular. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the silence between us louder than any argument we'd ever had. I had spent the whole day trying to think of the right words to say, the perfect way to bring up how I was feeling without starting another fight. "I miss us," I finally said, my voice barely audible. He didn't even look up from his phone. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I feel like I'm losing you," I said, the lump in my throat threatening to choke me. He sighed, setting his phone down with exaggerated patience. "I'm still here, aren't I?" But he wasn't. Not really. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if this was what love was supposed to feel like. This constant ache, this unshakable loneliness. I wondered if I was fooling myself into believing that things could ever go back to the way they were. Looking back now, I can see how much he manipulated me, how he used my love for him as a leash to keep me from leaving. But at the time, all I could see was the man I had fallen in love with, the man I still believed was somewhere beneath the cold, distant facade he'd become. I didn't want to give up on him, even when it felt like he had already given up on me. So I stayed. And with every day that passed, I felt myself shrinking more and more, until I barely recognized the person staring back at me in the mirror. But I couldn't let go. Not yet. Because even then, even when I knew deep down that I deserved better, a part of me still believed that if I just tried hard enough, loved him enough, he would come back to me. I hadn't been to therapy in weeks. At first, it felt like a small rebellion, something I was doing to take back control of my life, even if it meant shutting out the one person who had been trying to help me. Dr. Morgan had always been calm, patient, and understanding, but lately, even his carefully chosen words felt like too much. I stopped answering his calls after the first few days. They started off frequent, his voice on the other end of my voicemail urging me to reach out when I was ready. Then the calls became less frequent, and eventually, they stopped. That silence should have felt like relief, but instead, it left me feeling more adrift than ever. Without anyone to talk to, my thoughts became a relentless echo. Every mistake I'd ever made, every failure, every moment I wasn't enough, they all played on a loop in my mind, growing louder as the days passed. I told myself I didn't need help, that I just needed time. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was spiraling, and I didn't know how to stop. That night, the loneliness became unbearable. I didn't have friends to call or family to lean on, and the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. The bottle of cheap whiskey sitting on the counter had been calling to me all day, and I finally gave in. I poured glass after glass, the burn of the alcohol dulling the ache in my chest. It wasn't the first time I'd tried to drown my pain, but tonight felt different. I didn't want to numb myself. I wanted to forget. By the time I finished half the bottle, the world was spinning. I stumbled to the couch, clutching the glass in one hand, the other hand gripping the edge of the cushion for balance. "Here's to nothing," I muttered, raising the glass in a mock toast. The apartment was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, until it was broken by an unexpected knock at the door. It was sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that demanded attention. My first instinct was to ignore it. Whoever it was, they could wait. But then it came again, louder and more insistent. Grumbling under my breath, I stumbled toward the door, my vision blurring slightly as I fumbled with the lock. When I finally opened it, I froze. Dr. Morgan stood there, his expression a mixture of concern and frustration. He was still dressed in his usual work clothes, slacks and a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, but his tie was loosened, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. What are you doing here?" I slurred, leaning heavily against the doorframe for support. "I was worried," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You haven't been to your sessions. You haven't answered my calls. I didn't know if you were okay." "Well, as you can see, I'm just fine," I replied, waving the glass in my hand for emphasis. His eyes flicked to the glass, then back to me, his jaw tightening. "Can I come in?" I wanted to say no, to shut the door in his face and retreat back into my haze. But something in his expression stopped me. Something I couldn't quite place. Reluctantly, I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was a mess. Empty bottles littered the counter, and the coffee table was covered in crumpled tissues and takeout containers. I caught him glancing around, but he didn't say anything about the state of the place. "You shouldn't be here," I muttered, collapsing back onto the couch. He pulled up a chair across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm here because I care," he said simply. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You're my therapist. You're paid to care." "That's not why I'm here," he replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm here because you're shutting yourself off from the world, and I can see how much it's hurting you." I looked away, staring at the nearly empty bottle on the coffee table. "I'm fine," I said, though even I didn't believe the words. "You're not fine," he said, leaning forward. "And it's okay to admit that. You don't have to do this alone." "Maybe I want to be alone," I shot back, my voice rising. "Maybe I'm tired of people pretending to care when they don't." He didn't flinch at my words. If anything, he looked more determined. "I'm not pretending," he said quietly. "And you know that." His calmness only made me angrier. "Why do you even care? I'm just another name on your client list. You probably have dozens of other people to worry about. Why waste your time on me?" "Because you matter," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And whether you believe it or not, your life has value. I'm not going to let you throw that away because you're hurting." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I hated how vulnerable they made me feel. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow. "You're wasting your breath," I muttered, taking another swig from my glass. "I don't think I am," he said, his eyes steady. "Because somewhere deep down, I think you want to fight. You just don't know how." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, I didn't see my therapist. I saw someone who genuinely cared, someone who wasn't giving up on me even when I had given up on myself. But the fear, the shame, the pain, they were still there, clawing at the edges of my mind. "What if I can't?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What if I'm too far gone?" "You're not," he said firmly. "No one is, but you have to let someone in. You can't do this on your own." For a moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let his words sink in, to trust that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. "Thanks for the pep talk," I said, forcing a smirk. "But I think you've done enough for one night." He hesitated, clearly torn, but eventually he stood. "I'll check on you tomorrow," he said. "And the day after that, and the day after that. As long as it takes." I didn't respond, and he left without another word, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the faint, nagging hope that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The morning light was unkind, slipping through the curtains and illuminating the chaos of the previous night. My head throbbed in rhythm with the faint ache of regret sitting heavy in my chest. I dragged myself to the kitchen, barely able to meet my own reflection in the glass of the microwave door as I passed it. The memory of Liam at my door, his steady voice cutting through my drunken haze, played over and over in my mind. His concern, his patience, and my sharp, defensive words. It was too much to sit with. I hated how I'd acted, how I'd pushed away the only person who had shown up for me when I needed it most. I spent the better part of the morning working up the courage to make the call, my phone sitting on the counter like a judge waiting for my confession. My fingers hovered over his name in my contacts, anxiety twisting my stomach into knots. But I couldn't ignore what I knew I had to do. Taking a deep breath, I pressed call and held my breath as the line rang. "Dr. Morgan," his familiar voice answered, calm and collected as always. "Hi, it's me," I blurted out, my voice cracking slightly. I wanted to apologize for last night." There was a brief pause, and I braced myself for whatever might follow. "You don't have to apologize," he said finally, his tone warm and forgiving. "But I'm glad you called." "No, I do," I insisted, gripping the counter for support. "I was rude, and I shouldn't have acted like that. You didn't deserve it, especially after after everything you did to help me." "I understand," he replied, his voice still soft, steady. "You were in a tough place. I don't take it personally." His kindness only deepened the shame I felt. "I still want to make it right," I said quietly. "And I think I need to come back to therapy, if you'll still have me as a client." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I think that's a great idea. We can set something up for later this week, if that works for you." "Yeah," I said, relief flooding through me. "That works. Thank you." I hung up the phone, feeling lighter, though the knot of embarrassment in my chest hadn't fully disappeared. Still, it was a start. When I walked into his office a few days later, I half expected him to treat me differently, to look at me with pity or judgment. But he greeted me with the same calm smile, like nothing had happened. "How are you feeling today?" he asked as I sat down on the couch. "A little embarrassed," I admitted, twisting my hands in my lap. "But better, I think." "Embarrassment is normal," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But you're here, and that's what matters." We talked for the rest of the session, not diving too deeply into anything heavy, but enough to remind me why I'd started coming to him in the first place. As the hour came to an end, I hesitated at the door, turning back to face him. "Thank you," I said softly, for not giving up on me." "I told you before," he replied with a small smile. "I'm here for as long as you need." Something about his words stayed with me even after I left, echoing in my mind as I walked home. The following week, after our regular session, he surprised me with an offer. "You know," he said as we wrapped up, "it might help to step outside the office once in a while. Sometimes, just having a conversation over coffee can make things feel a little less clinical." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you saying we should hang out?" "Not exactly," he replied with a chuckle. "But if you ever feel like grabbing a coffee, just to talk, not about therapy, I'd be open to that." It felt strange at first, but the next Friday, I found myself sitting across from him at a small cafe down the street from his office. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air as we settled into a booth by the window. For the first time in what felt like forever, we didn't talk about my problems. Instead, we talked about movies, books, and even debated whether pineapple belonged on pizza. "Let me guess," I said, smirking over the rim of my latte. "You're one of those people who think coffee should only be black." "And you're one of those people who put 3 pumps of syrup in theirs," he shot back, his smile reaching his eyes. It was easy, light. It felt normal. We started meeting every week, always at the same cafe. There was no pressure, no expectations. It was just 2 people sharing an hour of quiet conversation, a break from the chaos of life. I didn't realize how much I needed it until it became a routine. And though we never talked about it, those simple meetings were a reminder that healing didn't have to be all at once. Sometimes, it was just about showing up, about letting yourself exist in the moment without the weight of everything else. Things were better now. That much I couldn't deny. The heaviness that used to follow me everywhere, the constant weight in my chest, it wasn't as crushing as it had been before. Therapy helped. Our sessions felt like a lifeline, a place where I could lay down the tangled mess of my thoughts without fear of judgment. And then there were the coffee meetups, which had quickly become something I looked forward to each week. Sitting across from Liam, laughing about nothing in particular, made me feel human again, like I was a person, not just a collection of broken pieces. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the questions that had started creeping into my mind. They were quiet at first, like whispers at the back of my thoughts, but they grew louder as time went on. Did he really care about me? Or was this just pity disguised as kindness? It wasn't something he'd ever said or done directly. If anything, he'd always been careful to treat me with respect, to make me feel like I mattered. But sometimes, when I caught him looking at me, I wondered what he saw. Was I a friend to him, or just a project he felt obligated to fix? Did he meet me for coffee because he wanted to, or because he thought I couldn't handle being alone? The doubt was exhausting, looping in my head like a song I couldn't stop replaying. I hated that I was even questioning it, especially after everything he'd done for me. But the questions wouldn't go away. And then there was another, even more unsettling thought. Was I actually getting better? Or was I just convincing myself that I was? It was true that I wasn't crying myself to sleep anymore, that the days didn't feel as unbearable as they once had. But what if that was just temporary? What if the progress I thought I was making was nothing more than a fragile illusion, one that could shatter the moment something went wrong? Some nights, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the old fears creeping back in. The doubts, the insecurities, the nagging voice that told me I wasn't enough. Those were the moments that scared me the most, when I realized how thin the line was between feeling okay and falling apart again. I started second-guessing everything: my progress, my connection with Liam, even my own emotions. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if the lightness I felt during our coffee meetups was real, or if I was just clinging to the idea of him as a lifeline. Did I genuinely enjoy his company, or did I need him to fill the void of loneliness I couldn't bear to face on my own? The worst part was that I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Who would I even tell? The whole point of those meetings was to escape the heaviness, to exist outside the walls of therapy. Bringing it up to him would ruin that, wouldn't it? It would make everything awkward, change the dynamic we'd built. And yet, the questions lingered, circling in my mind until I couldn't ignore them anymore. I needed to know. I needed to understand what this all meant, what we meant. As I sat in my apartment one evening, staring out the window at the rain streaking down the glass, I made a decision. The doubts, the second-guessing, the uncertainty, I couldn't live with it anymore. I needed clarity. I needed answers. I just didn't know what those answers would mean for us. The decision to talk to him had felt right, even inevitable. The questions swirling in my mind were too much to ignore, and I knew I wouldn't find peace until I had answers. It wasn't a session day, but I convinced myself he wouldn't mind. After all, he always said I could reach out if I needed to. And this felt important. When I walked into the familiar building, my stomach twisted with nerves. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights in the waiting room, the quiet rustle of papers at the reception desk, it was all the same as always. But something felt off. "Hi, I'm here to see Dr. Morgan," I said hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist looked up, her smile polite but distant. "Oh," she said after a moment, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Morgan doesn't work here anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He doesn't work here? Since when?" She glanced down at her computer, as if the answer might magically appear on the screen. "I believe he left earlier this week," she said carefully. "I'm not sure of the details, but his clients should have been informed." Her words blurred together, drowned out by the pounding in my ears. I barely managed to mumble a thank you before turning and rushing out of the building. The air outside felt colder than it had been when I arrived, or maybe it was just the chill settling into my bones. He was gone. The thought repeated itself in my mind, each time more suffocating than the last. Liam, my therapist, my confidant, my friend, had left without a word, without telling me. The one person who had been there for me, who had made me believe that I wasn't alone, was gone. I barely noticed how I got home. The streets blurred together, a haze of noise and movement that I couldn't process. By the time I stumbled through my front door, my hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my keys. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at my phone, my chest tightening with every passing second. No, he wouldn't just leave. He wouldn't do that. Before I could overthink it, I dialed his number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each second stretching into eternity. When he finally answered, his voice was hurried, almost breathless. "Hello?" "Liam," I said, my voice cracking. "What's going on? I went to your office, and they said you don't work there anymore. Why didn't you tell me? Are you leaving me too?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear him exhale slowly. "I was going to tell you," he said, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "I swear, I was planning to tell you tomorrow when we met for coffee. I didn't want you to hear it like this." "Then why didn't you say anything sooner?" I asked, the words rushing out before I could stop them. You knew how much I've been through, how hard it is for me to trust people, and now you're just gone? Please, he said, his tone gentle but urgent. Let's talk about this in person. Can you meet me in an hour? Same cafe. I hesitated, the weight of my anger and hurt pressing down on me. But beneath it all, there was something else in his voice, something that made me want to hear him out. Okay, I whispered. An hour later, I walked into the cafe, my heart pounding as I spotted him sitting at our usual table. He stood as I approached, his expression a mixture of relief and nervousness. I'm so sorry, he said as soon as I sat down. I should have told you sooner. I didn't want it to happen like this. Why? I asked, cutting straight to the point. Why did you leave? And why didn't you tell me? He ran a hand through his hair, something I'd only seen him do when he was truly stressed. It's complicated, he began, his eyes meeting mine. I left because I realized I couldn't keep being your therapist. The words hit me like a jolt, and for a moment I thought I'd misheard him. What do you mean? It's against professional ethics, he said carefully. Therapists aren't supposed to form personal relationships with their clients outside of therapy. And the more we talked, the more I realized that I wasn't just your therapist anymore. I cared about you, too much to keep things professional. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. So, what? You left because you didn't want to help me anymore? No, he said quickly, leaning forward. That's not it at all. I left because I wanted to help you in a way that didn't feel forced by my role as a therapist. Because I care about you. More than I should. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I blinked, feeling tears well up in my eyes. You care about me? Yes, he said softly, his voice breaking slightly. And I didn't want to keep pretending it was just about therapy. You're smart, kind, strong, and every time we talked, I found myself wanting to know you more, not as a client, but as you. The tears spilled over, and I quickly wiped them away, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions crashing over me. I don't know what to say, I whispered. You don't have to say anything, he said gently. I just wanted you to know the truth, and I'm still here if you'll let me be. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came in full force, and I buried my face in my hands, sobbing quietly as the weight of his words settled over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tears weren't from pain or despair. They were from something else, something warmer, something I couldn't quite name yet, but didn't want to let go of. Admitting my feelings for Liam wasn't easy. I had spent so much time convincing myself that it wasn't possible, that it wasn't real, that he only cared out of duty or pity. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to deny the truth. He had been patient, kind, and steady through everything, never pressuring me, always making me feel like I could just be myself around him. One evening, as we sat together, I finally let my guard down. Liam, I began, my voice shaking slightly. He turned to me, his expression soft but curious, waiting for me to find the words. I don't know how to say this, but I can't pretend anymore. I care about you, more than I should. For a moment, I worried he might pull away, but instead, he reached out and gently took my hand in his. I care about you too, he said simply, his voice calm but filled with emotion. It felt like the weight of the world lifted off my chest, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something good, something real. Our relationship grew naturally from there. Liam was everything I could have hoped for, gentle, understanding, and endlessly patient. He knew how fragile I still was, and he never pushed me to move faster than I was ready. Every moment with him felt safe, warm, and right, as though the universe was finally giving me a chance at happiness. But life has a way of throwing challenges at you when you least expect it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had just returned from the store, a bag of groceries in my hand, when I saw him. My ex. He was standing on the other side of the street, his face unmistakable even after all this time. My heart froze, and it felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under me. I tried to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but he noticed me almost instantly. He crossed the street with a casual confidence that made my stomach churn, as though nothing had ever happened between us. "Hey," he said, his tone light, as though we were old friends catching up. I couldn't respond. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred as panic took over. The bag slipped from my hands, and the sound of groceries hitting the pavement barely registered in my ears. My chest tightened, and it felt as though I couldn't get enough air. The world around me spun, the memories of all the pain and heartbreak he had caused crashing down on me like a tidal wave. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice distant, muffled by the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Before I could collapse completely, I felt familiar arms wrap around me. Liam. His presence was like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink. "Breathe," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "I'm here. You're safe." I focused on his voice, on the way his hands gently guided me to sit down on the curb. He stayed close, grounding me, shielding me from the rest of the world until the worst of the panic passed. Slowly, the fog lifted, and I realized my ex was still standing there, staring at us with a mixture of confusion and discomfort. "What the hell are you doing here?" Liam's voice had changed, no longer calm and gentle but firm, protective. He stood, placing himself between me and my ex. "I was just saying hi," my ex said, raising his hands defensively. "I didn't mean anything by it." "You didn't mean anything?" Liam's voice was cold, sharp. "Do you have any idea what you put her through? What she's been dealing with because of you?" My ex looked taken aback, his mouth opening as though to defend himself, but Liam didn't give him the chance. "Leave. Now. And don't ever come near her again. Do you understand me?" For a moment, I thought my ex might argue, but something in Liam's tone left no room for debate. My ex muttered something under his breath before turning and walking away, disappearing down the street. Liam turned back to me, his expression softening instantly. He knelt down beside me, taking my hands in his. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle again. I nodded, though tears streamed down my face. I didn't expect to see him. It brought everything back." "It's okay," he said, pulling me into his arms. "You don't have to explain. You're safe now. I promise." I buried my face in his chest, letting the tears flow freely. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of my emotions or afraid of being vulnerable. With Liam, I felt truly protected, and for the first time in a long time, I believed that things could finally be okay. Liam held me close that evening, his arms wrapped securely around me as if shielding me from everything that had ever hurt me. I hadn't stopped crying since we got back to my apartment, but he didn't rush me, didn't try to force me to stop. He simply stayed there, whispering soft reassurances into my ear, his steady presence anchoring me when I felt like I could fall apart again. As the hours passed, the panic and fear ebbed away, replaced by something softer, something warmer. I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. For the first time, I let myself truly believe in the safety he offered, in the love he had shown me time and time again. When I finally pulled back to look at him, his eyes met mine with a gentleness that made my chest ache. "I meant what I said," he murmured, brushing a stray tear from my cheek. "You're safe now. I'll make sure of it." I nodded, not trusting my voice to form the words I wanted to say. Instead, I reached out and held his hand tightly, as if that simple gesture could say everything I couldn't. In the days that followed, something shifted inside me. I realized I didn't have to carry the weight of my pain alone anymore. Liam had shown me that I could let someone in, that I could trust again, and it didn't make me weak. It made me stronger. Together, we started building a life that felt real and full of promise, one where I could finally let go of the ghosts that had haunted me for so long. But it wasn't just Liam who changed things. It was me too. I began to see myself through his eyes, not as someone broken, but as someone worthy of love and kindness. Slowly, but surely, I started to believe it. Looking back now, I can't pinpoint the exact moment everything changed for me. Maybe it wasn't a single moment, but a collection of them. The quiet nights spent laughing with Liam, the afternoons where I felt the sunlight on my skin and thought, for the first time in years, that the world wasn't such a terrible place. What I do know is that I'm not the same person I was when I first walked into Liam's office. I'm stronger now, more willing to fight for myself and for the life I want. I've learned that healing isn't linear, that there are setbacks and struggles, but they don't define me. Liam always told me that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to carry everything on my own. For a long time, I didn't believe him, but now, sitting beside him as he reaches for my hand and smiles at me like I'm the only person in the world, I know he was right. Maybe the most important thing I've learned is that love doesn't have to hurt. It doesn't have to break you or leave you questioning your worth. Real love is steady and kind, the kind that helps you grow instead of pulling you down. And now, for the first time in a very long time, I know what that feels like. This isn't the ending I thought I'd get, but maybe that's the beauty of it. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but sometimes it surprises you with something even better. Something that feels like coming home.